Hi. So a couple of weeks ago I read this article on Wine News titled Pope Francis Updates the Catholic Church's Code to Fight Paedophilia. So I just want to read the article to you, and then I just want to kind of break it down. I've written some thoughts down. The Catholic Church has faced sharp criticism over the years for not doing enough to protect kids under its purview from abuse. But on Tuesday, Pope Francis changed the tone of action by updating the Catholic Church's criminal code. Now priests who sexually abuse minors will face penalties. This move marked the most heavy revision to the Code of Canon Law in almost 40 years, following a long process. Activists had been pressing for an urgent need to change abuse laws within the Church to protect kids. Recent complaints by victims of sexual abuse have also pushed the Church to take stern measures. In the opening written remarks announcing the change, the Pope highlighted the restoration of justice, the reform of the offender, and the repair of scandal. In a press conference, Archbishop Filippo, Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts President, said that the changes are intended to reaffirm the seriousness of this crime and the attention to be paid to the victims. So instead of referring to sexual abuse against minors as paedophilia, the revision refers to the offences as dismissive of the sixth commandment wherein adultery is prohibited. Now the offences will be grouped under a new heading: offences against human life, dignity and liberty. Earlier, sexual crimes against minors were flagged under delicts against special obligations. A priest engaging in paedophilia will be stripped of his office and potentially face other just penalties if he commits an offence against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue with a minor. The changes will take effect in December. Pope Francis said that the revision intends to rewrite the ideals of justice and mercy which have been misinterpreted. In addition, he said that the revision would limit the dependence on discretion of judges while dealing with such crimes. Pope Francis took charge in 2013 and has undertaken several measures to counter the sexual abuse which has plagued the Church for decades. In 2019, Pope Francis called a summit on clerical sex abuse while lifting rules of secrecy which critics thought used to hinder investigations. Lifting rules of secrecy, just mind boggles. Okay, so I've written down some thoughts. When I speak off the cuff, I know I sort of flow a bit more naturally, so I might be a little stiff because I'm reading. But just bear with me. My intent is to just put as much of this information that I had in my mind out in a sort of logical way. So, okay. As an ex-pastor, this article on wine caught my eye. In my training and work experience, I've had first-hand experience of the ugly business of the Church abusing its power. I read the article and had to chuckle every few sentences at its ludicrous content, but over the days that followed, my chuckles turned to anger and outrage. The sterile veneer that the Pope is trying to plaster over the crimes that his Church has tolerated and perpetuated for so long is unacceptable. I aim my outrage not only at the Catholic Church, but at all Christian denominations where this heinous practice continues and is hidden to this day. Following are my personal views. The first thing that leapt out was the Pope's declaration: now priests who sexually abuse minors will face penalties. As opposed to what exactly? Welcome to planet Earth. The Catholic Church has a history of hiding its sexual abuse incidents with its in-house management strategy of secrecy and suppression, making prosecution virtually impossible. The Church's default response to any victim brave enough and determined enough to come forward as an adult to disclose their experience, provided they have enough evidence, has been to offer them an out-of-court settlement on condition that a gag order is adhered to. I find myself absolutely gobsmacked that the Pope and his hierarchy of elders are able to hear God's voice so clearly on his views on abortion, birth control, divorce, and what to preach about, but not hear their loving God chime in on the child sex abuse happening right under his omnipresent nose. God is apparently quite disengaged and seemingly mute on the topic of his youngest and most vulnerable humans being raped by the appointed shepherds of his flock, and as if that was not mind-bending enough, God appears to be unmoved to speak any louder about the way the rapes have been hidden by his church for centuries. No. God seems okay that his offending serial rapist representatives are often moved around to other parishes with their same powers, with no warning given to the new parish, guaranteeing that the same atrocities occur again and again. So it appears that to God and the Pope, the protection of the Church's reputation and public image is far more important than the mere rape of vulnerable children. So this God who runs the show appears to me as an evil monster. What a relief to know that there is no God running the show in the Church. It is the human ego. And there it is. It suddenly all makes so much sense. This human ego church therefore requires very human accountability structures to be put in place. But for argument's sake, I'll go along with the Church's claim that the God they serve is real, omnipresent, interested, all-powerful, and a loving being. In the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, a prophet is walking by when some teenagers formed a tormenting gang who followed him out of the town to a wooded area, hurling insults on him as he walked, as they found his bald head to be amusing. This man of God, filled with God's love, looked back at them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the nearby woods and tore all 42 youths into pieces. In this instance, God shows no objective compassion or understanding towards these youths, whose frontal brain lobes were not yet developed and who were obviously affected by a predictable youthful peer-pressured group dynamic. God effectively fulfills his man's request, murdering teenagers horrifically. Bears maul, rip and tear. It would not have been quick or painless. Imagine if a modern man of God cursed these child-raping priests in his name today. God wouldn't have to tear them all into pieces with a couple of bears, although this might be a great start. He would simply have to instruct his good shepherds to expel and expose these disappointing failure shepherds from his flock, thereby keeping his children safe. But no, either the Christian God has the stomach for causing, observing and allowing carnage, destruction and terror on the weak, or perhaps there are no good shepherds to hear him, or at best who are only able to hear the more comfortable tones of God's low-hanging fruit. I hope I'm not losing some of you with the edge that I'm taking against the apathy of God and his appointed shepherds who claim to know his will, but when it comes to the universally abhorrent act of a child being raped, we may start to picture the literal implications of what actually happens in such an event, but it's too unpleasant to imagine in detail. There is the strong reflex to do a mental U-turn and focus rather on our empathy for the victim in the now. I believe that the secular world needs to shoulder the burden that the Catholic Church will not, as it is a unique rape in the irony that it happens on the very lap of God. Please allow me to walk through what I believe would be the practical steps that a priest would need to take in order to rape a child. My goal is to deliver a clear and uncomfortable perspective, one that I hope will stoke conversation, ideas and actions, one that will fan the flames of the passion that burns in all of us compassionate, rational human beings to bloody well do something about this. For a predator priest to be a success, he must first complete his studies. This can take between 4 and 13 years. Then he can be placed in a trusted position of power within a community. Within this community, he must present himself as a channel of God's love, wisdom, insight, and service to the entire congregation. He must be so involved with the community that all of its members are used to seeing him moving about within it. Once this base is established, he needs to choose a victim. Is he sexually attracted to girls or boys? Perhaps both, and he must follow his gut as to what age turns him on the most. Priests will have privileged access to private matters regarding a family's background, and would be able to detect what supports are in place around each child. Things like families being in a difficult social or financial situation, or families rocked from a painful past, often involving a loss. And of course there is the blood in the water to the priest of a child with an absent parent or parents. Orphans especially would be spiritually vulnerable and receptive to being adopted by both the masculine and feminine energies of God the Father and Mary the Mother. These insights are a superpower for the priest when earmarking the children who would be most vulnerable to the voids in their lives, being filled by the love and acceptance of God and Mary, embodied by their priest, who is skillfully positioned as the gatekeeper. Once a suitable candidate is chosen, the priest needs to build a rapport with them, and a desensitization process is started. Physical affection must be normalized, masked by games, prayer, or masquerading as pure non-sexual parental affection. The practiced predators soon learn to hide their erections around other adults as they see their grooming taking hold. Then they have to engineer the opportunity to isolate the child, a venue providing privacy and time. Finally, alone, each priest's personal predatory personality can express itself. From a long progression of games and play wrestling, resulting in intimate positions, culminating in the act of anal penetration, to the explosively violent and terrifying surprise rape. Fellatio also being introduced on a bell curve scale, with gentle, guided, coaxing and coercion on the one side, to violent, throat-bruising, mouth-stretching suffocation on the other. Ultimately, the same orgasmic release for the priest is achieved with a child as their conduit. Adult sexual health guidelines regarding consensual anal sex recommends the gradual dilation of the receiving partner's sphincter with fingers or sex toys, with generous quantities of lubrication being applied before penis penetration is attempted. This is to reduce discomfort and to minimize or eliminate any tissue tearing. It is unlikely that a child would tolerate gradual dilation of their sphincter, and the pre-rape application of lubrication may well also meet objection. So the logical, obvious outcome for the child is under-lubricated, undilated penetration. This would be agony. Tearing and bruising would be unavoidable. This fact will result in the need for the priest to physically constrain a child convulsing in reflex pain and fear. No doubt the child would cry out for help to their mother or father, or perhaps even to God. Imagine the mental gymnastics this child predator has to wrestle with as he sees his misalignment with his God. But clearly the priest has no fear that God might smite him dead, as he did the man who reached out to stop the ark from falling. Perhaps if the child cried out, but in God's name, like his prophet did, perhaps 2 she-bears might have appeared, or perhaps even 1. But alas, no bears come. The child cries would be discouraged and physically muffled, but a predator rapist with some foresight would surely choose a venue where the odd, exhilarating, unmuffled scream could not be heard, except by the omnipresent Creator, of course, and his priest. Lightning did not strike the first time the priest raped a child, so he bravely pushes on, his selfish lust and unbridled ego covering his multitude of sins. I wonder, as the priest delivers the Eucharist to his cockled congregation later that day, perhaps even to the child's ironically kneeling open-mouthed parents, with traces of fresh rape blood still on his fingers, as he touches the wafer, the very body of Jesus, does the priest and God blush a little? Alas, no, and still no lightning. Now I would like to talk about the surgically precise dialogue that would certainly accompany the ritualistic physical raping of a child. The matador's death stab, mutilating their soul into deformed silence. This would also serve the priest as a helpful antidote to the inconvenient post-orgasm guilt that at least some of the priests may feel. Perhaps the transference of guilt from priest to child is a place to start. The priest might say, "You made me do this. You held my hand and moved it onto you. You wanted to sit on my lap." And any other manipulative blame dump that a post-traumatically stressed child would accept as the truth from the embodiment of God. And of course, the heart-wrenching dialogue that merges the confusion, agony, terror and fear of what had just happened to actually being a loving and special encounter with God. The priest might say, "This is how you feel the love of God inside you. You are so blessed, so chosen, so special. I love you, my child." The priest would literally and figuratively be the embodiment of God during the act. And then, with some imagination and years of biblical studies, there are some useful justification scriptures to bring truth to the specialness, the goodness and holiness of the act. the special bond that King David and Jonathan had, or how close Jesus and his disciple John were. Rich pickings if the priests just apply themselves to the task. Perhaps they got a pamphlet of sorts handed to them from a senior, well-practiced rapist priest who had used various scriptures on post-rape victims and found some real tried and tested winners. The priest might say, "Pray that God will help you understand and accept his wisdom in choosing you for this sacred connection. Ask him to show you that you are deserving of his love in this way." There would, of course, need to be a secret privacy agreement in place to underline how special and unique this connection was. And for the less accomplished manipulator, the duller priest-rapist, there is always the bludgeon of intimidation, threat, and fear, and why not use their station of privilege and power to thrust the pact of secrecy home? Let us scratch the surface of this diabolical Pandora's box of dialogue. The priest might say, "If you tell anyone about what you have done, your mother will burn in hell for eternity." Or he may try another line. "If you tell anyone about our special love, you will lose the love of God, your Creator, forever, and you will be lost in hell for eternity to burn with Satan." Or perhaps, "If you show anyone your bleeding, or any of these marks, or breathe a word of what we did to anyone, I shall ask God to throw every one you love into the fires of hell, yes, even your puppy." Or, "If you tell anyone about the special gift God has given you, it will lose its power, and God your Father will not love you anymore, as you will have rejected him." You get the point. The priest will probably use a healthy combination of all of the above, depending on the type of child and in what mental state they appear to be after the rape. All things going to plan, this should maintain a stable and sustainable environment of rape on demand for the priest for the longest practical time. How could a newly recruited victim escape or be rescued from this hell? Well, disappointingly, help does not come from within God's church. Church history has shown that any child brave enough to confide in another member of the clergy, asking for help, ultimately receives no help from within God's family at all. For even the most well-meaning clergy must ultimately submit to God's chain of command and trust their superiors. This means that as the cry for help meanders like a thick incense up that chain of command and into the olfactory of the scandal level of the bureaucracy, it is ignored, hidden, or disbelieved. It seems that one way it may stop is if a member of the public catches a priest in the act of raping a child and takes this information to the police. This still may be quashed, though. The church has many high-level friends in these systems. Oh, if only the victims had some high-level friends. The other way out of this hell, the most common path, regretfully, is when the child grows old enough to an age where their will is stronger and their gullibility weaker. This is usually when the victim reaches their early to late teens, depending on their nature, and the degree to which their soul has been obliterated. When, to the priest, a young adult may be deemed too high a risk to continue raping, the priest will reluctantly cut their losses and put their faith in the fact that their secret will remain buried under the heavy gravel of fear, guilt, and shame. But this may mean a child would be marinating in the climate of godly rape for years as their minds and bodies patiently, growing in the shadows, dig their escape tunnel as they physically mature. But for each expensive year in this priestly greenhouse, they will have to endure 52 weeks of being harvested on scheduled days or as opportunity presents. Most victims will have to survive into adulthood carrying their inner victimized child with them. As adults, they may one day have the will and support to bravely come forward to tell their inner child's story and attempt to expose what had happened to them for so many years. And how are these wounded souls received by the church? In holy garbs they close ranks with complete amnesia of Mark 9:42, which reads, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it is better for him if a heavy millstone is hung around his neck and he is thrown into the sea." I am not confronted by story after story of priests coming forward voluntarily, driven by repentance, by their need to unburden their hypocrisy, confessing about the many rapes they have committed. Not even one. I personally would accept even a light millstone hung around their necks as a sign of repentance, but they should still be thrown into the sea. God is at least consistently deaf to the value of the children. We have looked at the act, we've looked at the spoken word, and now I would like to try to grasp some of the emotional impact on a child having had their soul planet hit by this church-sized asteroid, an extinction-level event. I ask for the tolerance and grace of any sex abuse victims who may be listening. All children start out with detectable vulnerabilities, but some have a bigger wobble, a more noticeable void. They may be from less stable family structures or having had experienced trauma, or just from being an introverted and particularly sensitive child. These are the ones that typically are preyed upon by these priests. Can you imagine such a child's initial joy with the personal attention they would receive, the tangible love of God through their priest, an adult who is present, who they can look up to and feel safe with? There is the magical setting of the grand church building with its high ceilings, coloured windows, walls stacked with dramatic and symbolic art, a visual barrage skillfully, deliberately and manipulatively designed by the priest class to command authority over saved sinners by reinforcing the greatness of God and the smallness of man. This effectively hijacks our ancient hunter-gatherer hominid unconscious brain, which is programmed by evolution to want to belong to something bigger than the self and to trust the group. Add to this the echoing music, candles, flickering, and the child's joy in singing and being part of this gathering of community. The child is spiritually home, at ground zero, with no chance of escaping this mesmerizing black hole. The inner small self of the child, daring to hope, daring to trust this family of God. The child striving unconsciously for a nucleus around which to build itself, so they may lean forward into the world, into life. A priest in this context can only do a child in such a primed state great good or great harm. Enter the predator. The predator priest hacks into this pure, beautiful and perfect base of vulnerability, impressionability and teachability with his selfish ego. And by selfish I mean the using of the mind and body of this child for their own sexual pleasure for as long as they are able to extend and maintain it for. They take full advantage of their position of power that the church has in the community. Shamelessly they brandish their illusory connection to God, laundering their lust through the Wizard of Oz curtain of being God's representative on earth, not fearing for 1 second that God may tear through that very curtain as he did the one in the temple when Jesus died. So what happens to a child when their spark of life is channeled into the rape grinder? Perhaps if their faith is strong enough, they can translate the excruciating pain, confusion and humiliation of each rape into an opportunity of drawing closer to God by drawing closer to their priest. Maybe if they just keep trying harder. Maybe just like a mother in the pains of labor establishes a deeper bond with her child, they should believe in God and allow themselves to trust the process, for God's silent apathy reassures them that the secret coupling is ordained by him, or surely he would not allow it. But over the years of this hell, the priests cannot stop their cultivated victims' bodies and brains from growing and maturing, from asking questions and making observations. For as history demonstrates, even in the most stifling and tyrannical institutions, reason will elbow its way in. Each victim will have their own unique, sad and lonely moment, when their eyes looked down, the moment things fell into place. Baptized into the dark night of their soul by their introduction to betrayal. Even the strongest adult mind battles with this concept. Dante's Inferno reserves the 9th and deepest level of hell for betrayers, for the most severe punishment, for the most severe sin. This level of hell is where Satan himself is said to reside. The child starts comprehending that the priest was deceiving them from the first time they were together. Their priest had betrayed them. Their church had betrayed them. And dare they even think it, their God had betrayed them. How worthless must they have been to be treated in this way? What kind of betrayal or abuse is this? Is there even a name for the cascading collapse of trust, hope, and the will to live? And at the blackest part of their soul's dark night are the realizations. Realizing that they are not special, that they are not worthy of being part of God's family, realizing that the sex was never a special and holy God connection, and that somehow, through their effort, through their giving, and by their faith, they had become dirtied by it, realizing that when they had tried their hardest to believe that their most excruciating rape injuries were somehow building a Jacob's ladder to heaven, God had never been a part of that act. He had never been standing at the top of this illusory ladder with his outstretched arms that had comforted them through the worst of these sessions so many times. The realization that they had somehow failed God, that this was still somehow all their fault. The realization that they felt invisible to God, were invisible to God. The lonely, crushing realization that they dare not, cannot trust their God. Is it any wonder that children who have been sexually abused have a significantly higher rate of suicide than their unraped peers? Sexually abused boys, particularly, are up to 15 times more likely to kill themselves. Abused girls up to 5 times more likely. Oh, but of course in Catholicism, suicide is an unforgivable sin. Wow, God, really? Really? So when I read the Pope's opening remarks announcing the proposed changes, he attempted to encapsulate the scope of the whole travesty with these trifactored goals: the restoration of justice, the reform of the offender, and the repair of scandal. So am I to presume that the phrase restoration of justice is to include the complete new transparency of the Catholic Church on all matters regarding child sex abuse, past and present, including the release of their secret journals that record such occurrences, the legal accountability of offending priests with full cooperation given to secular legal investigation bodies, the financial support required to facilitate the healing of the physical and spiritual damage that has been done to vulnerable children for centuries by his appointed representatives of God? I must have missed that in the restoration of justice. It may well be a loaded outline with much meat on its bones, but it sounds a bit cold and sterile in the face of what the offence actually is. It sounds unrepentant. When it comes to the reforming of the offenders, I can't help slamming into the elephant in the room. We are not talking about a parent who needs anger management or needs to learn about nutrition to feed their kids better. A priest has abused their position within the church to rape a children, over a sustained period. These priests do not come forward to confess their crimes, but are dragged into secular justice after hiding for decades in the very institution in which God apparently lives. And here they shamelessly manipulate the law with their wealth and legal teams to intimidate any plaintiff. They offer out-of-court settlements on condition of gag orders being signed, or the threatening promise of resisting the secular wheels of justice in the most expensive ways, making the secular legal process unaffordable for the huge majority of cases. There obviously needs to be offender reform, but the reform needs to start with secular justice, with offender accountability. The way the many popes have dragged their knuckles over this issue for centuries is unforgivable. If Satan was real, he would be so proud that he had such fierce representation in his enemy's house. Double agents, smiting his most hated enemy's children under the nose of God. I believe that the true Satan is the dark side of human ego, the worst in man realized. Secular justice needs to start with 100% perpetrator prosecution. This would obviously include the offending priests, but must include all of the non-offending priests who knew about what their brothers in Christ were doing to these children, but who looked the other way. Those clergy who chose to protect the church from scandal by obstructing secular investigations, facilitating parish transfers, failing to warn the new parish of a predator, and who were involved in assisting with any cover-up of information that would have exposed this gross infection to the light of day. In some instances where sex abuse of minors occurs within a family, the spouse, most often the wife, may be aware that the abuse is occurring to their child or children, but they allow it to continue, as this takes some or all of any sexual responsibility or pressure off of them. In my mind, this makes them knowingly complicit in the act. Does the driver of a vehicle in a drive-by shooting not have as much guilt in the murder of the victim as their passenger who squeezed the trigger out of the passenger window? Relocating a child rapist priest to a different congregation is a practice that should stop immediately and be outlawed. If a daycare teacher was caught raping some of the children in their care, what kind of world would look the other way when the offending teacher was simply moved to another daycare center by the daycare governing body, and without warning the new daycare center about this dodgy teacher? And then that same governing body openly sought to quash any scandal related to these incidents, paying the parents of child victims to accept unconditional gag orders. How dare you, sir? How dare you? How different is this to when a serial child raping priest is moved from parish to parish by his superiors? It is no different, and the blood trail should be followed, and all knowledgeable, involved parties should be charged with all of the rapes left spiraling in the eddies of the child predator's priest's wake. Furthermore, I believe that prosecuted and convicted clergymen should serve their time in secular prison. This is the only platform to then discuss further reform of the offender. The power of secular law should compel the Catholic Church to strip any priest found guilty of child rape of their position as priest, and after their sentence has been served, they may never have any position of power in any church or over any children for the rest of their lives. And I recommend that a prison program be established for the antisocial sexual predator, tailored for this special breed of child abuser. This should be managed and staffed by secularly trained and credentialed mental health professionals. In this context, the offender should be given the opportunity to reform if they wanted to. Any offending priest not wanting to engage with any rehabilitation program would be free to opt out. They can fantasize and relive their most delightful memories of child rape on a masturbatory loop in the confines of a concrete prison cell for the rest of their lives. If you don't comply, you don't get out. From here forward, society's future safety from a convicted serial child rapist would have to be the primary focus. With this in mind, I suggest a secularly supervised ankle bracelet accountability program to roll out on all released convicted priests that they would remain a part of for the rest of their lives. The Catholic Church, which shamelessly displays its treasures to millions of tourists each year at the Vatican and around the world, should be made to pay in full for all legal and imprisonment costs for each priest found guilty of an offense. In no reality should our tax money pay for any of the Church's blasphemous criminal behavior. They should also be made to pay in full for all secular prison reform programs, and for the ankle monitoring and accountability program. There should be no priest released early for good behavior. Consequence and responsibility before throwing the concept of reforming offenders around, please. And as for the repair of scandal, a thing is what it is. All needs to be brought into the light first, before any scandal can be addressed. A transparent and repentant Catholic Church will have to be a different beast than the one it is now, moving forward into this brave new world. Imagine saying the following sentence to a man or woman who had been the victim of a serial priest rapist for years of their life under the Catholic Church's watch. Imagine saying this: "What are your thoughts on repairing the scandal brought onto the Church by their history of sex abuse on children?" Exactly. And when the Pope no longer wants to use the word paedophilia to refer to sexual abuse against minors, but replace the concept with acts of being dismissive of the sixth commandment wherein adultery is prohibited. Talk about diluting an abhorrent act and tacking it onto the unquestionable 10 Commandments. Shame on you, sir. I would like to replace the word paedophilia in the Church with the term rape of a child, as this is what it is. Where does that fit into the 10 Commandments of what not to do? Again, not too high on God's list of priorities. He wasted a few spots with no graven images and love me above all else. Let us remember the elaborate, carefully contrived, sticky path of predation that each offending priest has taken, from the choosing of their victims to finally plunging their penis into them, all the while spouting poisonous words into ears already ringing with shock to manipulate and paralyze their already vulnerable and freshly shattered bodies and souls into secrecy and compliance. And as for the Pope's other public relations suggestion of replacing the term paedophilia with the phrase offences against human life, dignity and liberty, no, sir. Offences against human life, dignity and liberty, this is too sterile an escape utterance for your predator priests. your church and your God. Shame on you all. And to add a final ridiculous twist to the tale, the Pope and his church need another 6 months before his proposed accountability changes will take effect. Only to be in effect December 2021. Wow. Just remind me, we are talking about a loving, living God appointing shepherds to look after his flock on earth with the Pope as the main guy he talks to. 6 months. Really? Wow. Truly, the Pope and God have both had a grand old chat about this bear bug and have thrashed out a plan that will roll out in due course. Be patient, my children. Sounds like a 6-month hall pass for any predator priest still raping under the radar to get their affairs in order with a thick layer of secrecy and hypocrisy. I wonder how many will come forward and confess over this period. I'm not holding my breath. I will wager not even one. This highest dose of radiation poisoning that God's Pope and his church have exposed these children's soul to will in most of the victims' cases not reach its half-life in each one of them for decades, and for some of them not in their lifetimes. The Pope's roundabout sorry just won't do. It's not enough. So where to from here? Let's keep this balloon of church accountability in the air, however each of us can. The churches have had their time and blown it. Let's keep them against the ropes and get the children out of their burning building. So let's talk to friends about these issues. Let's use social media to research and to reach out. Any inspiring stories or information, let's forward it to our friends group. And if you feel an opportunity and if you feel it's appropriate, ask a friend if they were ever abused or exposed to anything like that. And you might be able to support them through a process of them coming forward and bringing that to the light so that they can transform and not be damaged by secrecy and by carrying that limp, whether you want to customize a t-shirt or make your own bumper sticker, anything you can think of, because every one of us has power. Every one of us is a creative in our own way. Every one of us can be a champion for this cause. And to anyone who has been listening who has been the victim of a sexual abuse, whether this happened in the church or in another context, we as a human race need to hear your story. We need to know what happened for your healing as well as ours. We need to hear, we need to understand, so we can all stop this from happening to others, because we are all connected. So please reach out no matter where you are in your journey. And if you feel you need help, make sure you are not being vulnerable to the wrong people when you do reach out for help. Let us learn from the past, and I would recommend that you stay away from churches. But if you still feel that you want to use them, take a support person with you to all counseling sessions. I know there will be pure-hearted clergy out there who will want to help, but their in-house mismanagement and inability to take a child-centered stand against child rape has made their waters murky. The cost of the enemy being in their ranks is too expensive a price for you to pay after your previous experience. I recommend you look for professionally trained secular institutions, as they have stringent supervision and accountability structures in place. Even if it takes a few calls and referrals to find a place that feels right to you, take your time but reach out. So thank you for listening and for your time, and if you think this could be useful to anyone, then just play it forward and send it around, and I welcome any feedback. So until next time, I'll see you out there.